Hello, everyone. This is part one of week 5 of Plato, a class on the Protagoras, Phaedo, and Sophist. And we now turn to the Phaedo. In the Phaedo, Socrates is in prison. He is talking with his friends about the fact that soon he will be dead. And his friends are scared by that. So the question comes up of whether Socrates has an argument for the immortality of the soul. And in total, the dialogue offers 4 such arguments. They are sometimes called proofs of the immortality of the soul, but that is an overstatement. The Greek here is just logos, argument, or maybe even reasons for why you might think that the soul is immortal. And these arguments or reasons are not presented as necessarily persuasive or compelling. They are nevertheless presented as ideas or arguments that Socrates is greatly invested in. And I would propose that that is how we examine them, that we don't necessarily think that, there is a kind of secondary literature on this which finds mistakes in the arguments. And I don't think that any of the arguments are, as arguments, ultimately conclusive, as if they were proofs of the immortality of the soul. But that doesn't mean that there isn't anything philosophically interesting in them. So I would like to suggest the following method in thinking through this. Namely, that first we ask, what is precisely the demonstrandum? What is it that we need to show, or that Plato or Socrates think they want to show? Second, then, with respect to each of these arguments, what precisely is the argument? Third, what might be wrong with it? And fourth, what might still be philosophically interesting about it? And today I just want to talk a little bit about the first argument. And I want to talk only about this initial step. What is the demonstrandum? And then a little bit about this last step. What is it that might be compelling or interesting about the argument, even if it is not a persuasive proof of the immortality of the soul? So what is the demonstrandum? Socrates' friends say that they would like to know whether the soul of a human being exists after the person's death and has a certain dynamis, capacity or power, and has phronesis, insight, or the capacity for thinking, and a good capacity for thinking, or capacity for good thinking. And that is what interests them. And why is that interesting? They say that people who do not believe in the immortality of the soul, what is it that those people think? Well, they think the soul is some kind of stuff, breath, air, something like that. And when someone dies, then this air or breath just moves away and dissipates. So notably, that is a kind of materialistic or physicalist, if you like, conception of the soul. That is not the assumption that the soul is, as it were, a non-physical mind. Rather, it is assuming that the soul is some kind of stuff, air, breath, but that is kind of disappearing into the surroundings when someone dies. And it is almost as if a leaf falls off a tree and then disintegrates and turns into something else. And that, of course, could be a way in which the soul could survive after death. But that is presumably not what interests us when we think about immortality. When we ask, is the soul immortal? We want to know, am I still going to be there? And the way in which that is captured by Socrates' friends is to say, well, what we want to know is whether the soul is still there in a way where it has this kind of thinking capacity. And that might be a kind of minimum requirement for the soul still being, in some sense, who a person used to be. Now, the argument then, the first argument that is presented, and the details of this are on our handout, works with the assumption that opposites become, and this is Plato's technical notion of becoming, from each other. For example, that means that something becomes taller from having been smaller, or smaller from having been taller. Something becomes heavier from having been lighter, and lighter from having been heavier. Something wakes up from having been asleep, and falls asleep from having been awake. And the proposal is that that is also how being dead and being alive relate to each other. They relate to each other in a kind of cyclical relation of becoming from opposites. And that is a technical term here, becoming from opposites. And if that was compelling as an argument for immortality, it would mean that when something becomes dead from having been alive, then it's also going to become alive again from having been dead. Now, whether or not that is compelling as an argument for the immortality of the soul, I want to suggest that we examine this passage from the Phaedo just with a view to Plato's analysis of becoming. We already talked about this notion of becoming and the becoming distinction in the Protagoras, and then we saw this idea that human beings can only become virtuous, not be virtuous, because we live in the domain of becoming. And I would just like to invite you to think about this first argument for the immortality of the soul with a view to what does it suggest for Plato's analysis of the domain of becoming.